What's up, y'all? Today I want to go over 3 simple strategies of how to decrease hip flexor tightness without stretching. Stay tuned, it's going to be epic. And if we haven't met, hello, I'm Dr. Sarah, the Hip Doc. I love helping women runners with hip pain get back to running with confidence and comfort for the long run. First things first, the hip flexor is actually a really fascinating muscle, and I want to show you guys where it attaches and inserts, and I think that will help our brains think about what we need to do to make it feel less tight. So the hip flexor actually inserts into our spine, so onto the back of our spine, and it comes into the front and then attaches down into the hip. Let me show you on little skelly here. So it actually attaches onto these little transverse processes, and then it comes down and inserts into the lesser trochanter onto the front of the hip. So it spans this region from here to here. Looking through the hip flexor, if it attaches into my spine and then comes down through here, it's going to be lengthened when I'm in this position, because you can imagine this is a longer position, and it's going to be shortened when I'm in this posteriorly tilted position, because it's going to be relatively approximated. So let's think about different times of when and why it could be tight. Instances the hip flexor could get tight. Number one is from long bouts of, you guessed it, sitting. So that's going to hold it into that shortened position. You could actually be poor control over our trunk into that anterior pelvic tilt. Oftentimes people might have a natural resting posture like this, or they might just have a hard time controlling their trunk from going into this lengthened position of the hip flexor, maybe with things like squatting, picking stuff up and putting stuff down, or even potentially with running. This is going to cause increased tension and relative tightness to the hip flexor because it's constantly in its lengthened position. 3, with running specifically, I'll actually see runners overuse their hip flexors with running. This could be related to number 2, when maybe they're kind of stuck in this anteriorly pelvic tilted position when they're running, so they're having to use their hip flexor through a greater range, or also them have an inability to recruit their posterior chain, like their glute or their back, as efficiently and consistently. Of course, it's going to be recruited and on. Your butt's not going to be not working the whole time you're running, but maybe they're not using it as efficiently with allowing their legs to get back behind them, either with momentum or their glute, so then they're actually overusing their hip flexor as opposed to having their glute pull them back and their hip flexor pull them forward. Over 3 ways of how to fix this. If you're a sitter, this one might be for you. First one is going to be a unilateral hip bridge with rotation. So what you'll do is you'll lay on your back, your painful leg will stay in this bent position, the other one will go straight. You're going to come up into a bridge and rotate over. I'm keeping this leg nice and heavy, and I'm rotating. So what this is doing is taking this point and keeping it nice and fixed of the hip flexor and rotating the other point of the hip flexor, so it's getting a nice stretch. But what I'm also doing is I'm using this principle called reciprocal inhibition. So I'm turning on my glute, so the opposite muscle, to decrease tension through my hip flexor. I'm getting a little bit of recruitment through here, so I'm getting a nice muscle pump. You could think of it as like vascularizing, increasing kind of elasticity through muscle and getting it nice and relaxed. Now, with this one, you're not going to feel like a ton of stretch in the way that you might feel a ton of stretch as you're doing like a common hip flexor stretch like this one, but the principles are a little bit different. Instead of taking it and stretching the heck out of it, you're actually using your neural system to turn on the glute to turn off the decreased tonicity or tightness of the hip flexor, and you're also creating a muscle pump. So instead of just, my bicep was really sore, instead of just stretching the heck out of my bicep, I'm doing a light muscle activation to get increased juice in there to decrease stiffness. If you feel like you're someone that has poor control over the trunk into that extended position, like we talked about earlier, this one might actually be best for you. So what you'll do is you'll flop onto your hands and knees. I want you to find neutral with your spine. So you'll kind of drop your belly down and then arch it up, drop it down, arch it up, get that motion, and then find somewhere right in the middle. You can think of slightly zippering up your abdominals. You don't need to like clench or bear down, but you can just think of a light zipper. And then from here, without having your hips shift or your low back move, you're gonna extend one leg at a time. Now we went over the origin and attachment points of the hip flexor, and you can imagine that as I'm extending this leg, I'm getting a nice stretch through my hip flexor, but I'm also maintaining a nice neutral core where I'm not getting that extension and I'm not getting increased tension through my hip flexor. So I'm actually teaching myself how to maintain a more stable back that's not going to cause that overextension and constant resting tightness of my hip flexor. If I can regain that core ability to maintain control in a neutral position, it's going to decrease how much resting length tension is in my hip flexor, and then maybe I'm going to feel less relative tightness throughout the day. So this is a great neuro reprogramming exercise to say, okay, can I find neutral, and then can I lengthen my hip flexor without my low back moving, without it arching, keeping it nice and neutral, and can I do it without my hips shifting from side to side? So this one is going to be absolutely huge for people who maybe feel like they have a weaker core or even weaker hip stability as they're trying to use their core. This last one is actually the most advanced one. So you can see I'm wrapping a light band around my ankle that is anchored to a dumbbell. I'm in a wall plank position, so I'm keeping my back nice and neutral, not allowing it to arch, and then I'm actually lightly and gently strengthening my hip flexor. I'm actually not doing a ton of load here because I just want to get a nice muscle pump to that hip flexor while focusing on keeping a nice and neutral back. Quick note on that last one, this is actually an advanced version of the hands and knees exercise that we went over previously. So this one's actually really focusing on the ability to keep the back nice and neutral in an upright and standing position, more so than it is on loading the actual hip flexor. It's just a little bit more challenge to the back and core to make sure it can maintain that position. I was actually going to really strengthen the hip flexors if someone was having hip flexor tightness with running or after running. I would actually focus on the glutes first and then go into the hip flexor series with strengthening, and this is actually something that I go over more in depth in my hip stability series in the Empowered Runner. I hope you guys enjoyed that video and learned lots. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop it in the comments. If you want a step-by-step process of how to decrease hip flexor tightness, find the way to turn on your core and increase your hip stability, I'll give you a free gift with a 2-week free trial to the Empowered Runners Club. Inside lies my step-by-step hip stability program. Gals have been loving this. I can't wait for you to check it out.